Guys, here is our lecture that's going to discuss about the organization of the cell. And essentially, this is for Unit 4. Now, why cells are important? Well, if you remember from what we talked about previously, one of the things that you needed to be alive was what? Essentially, it was all living things are composed of cells. So essentially, that is the reason why cells matter, right? Anywhere from cells composing our food to the fact that we are actually composed of cells ourselves, to the fact that most of our building materials that we use, a lot of them, not all, but for instance, this wood house here, at one time was a living, breathing plant that essentially is made up of cells. So cells are important. Now, if we talk about just biology and society in regards to cells, you can look at penicillin, which was the first antibiotic to be discovered in 1920. And essentially why that was important is that drastically changed medicine. There were widespread deaths of millions of people across the world, especially when you're thinking about things like the Spanish flu. And a lot of those came from bacterial infections. And so the use of antibiotics worldwide helped us to drastically decrease the rate of death. Most antibiotics bind to structures found only in bacterial cell walls. So essentially, those antibiotics help to target enzymes and certain protein structures in bacterial cells that help to stabilize their cell walls. Now, those essentially, the proteins or the antibiotics bind to bacterial ribosomes, essentially, and ribosomes are important in protein creation. And what's so amazing about antibiotics is that they will essentially kill bacterial cells that are due to making it so that ribosomes, which we'll find out ribosomes are important in protein manufacturing, they will stop those proteins from being made. They will destabilize the outside of the cell wall and essentially kill bacteria. But while they're doing this, they completely leave alone human ribosomes. That's the reason why we can take them to help rid us of bacteria, but it doesn't kill us. So once we were able to discover the importance of penicillin, then from there we started making investigation and developing various other antibiotics. And so for us to understand essentially how life works, we essentially need to uncover how cells work. So organisms, as we talked previously, since everything's made up of cells, you can have cells that are organisms that are either single-celled, and a lot of those are prokaryotes or protists. Protists, think of things like amoebas. In prokaryotes, think of bacteria, essentially. And so when we look at those are just single-celled. There's just one of them. But then they can also be multicellular, such as plants, animals, and most fungi. So how did the history of the cell actually start?
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck two together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town, looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules, because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
So essentially, let's do a little review over some of these important people. So Robert Hooke actually helped coin the term the cell. And as you remember, they said because he thought that they looked like little rooms in monasteries that monks lived in. And you can see this is what a piece of cork tree actually looks like underneath a microscope. And it has very much organized with these small sections that look like kind of small rooms. Who also helped to put kind of embark on a lot of investigation into this is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. And if you remember, he was there to help identify or observe the very first living cell, a bacteria to be specific, or the living cell that was in the gook of the mouth, right? And this is what actually his microscopes look like. And she said, yeah, you could put a couple of them together to look like a pair of sunglasses, right? And so essentially on these, they're kind of interesting that this is right here where the little lens is. So you would just put where this little thing here ties, you put a little piece of glass or slide under there, and then you would look through it, and essentially that would show you the particular specimen. So this is some of the very, very first microscopes that were essentially put together. And then you had Schleiden, and he was a botanist in Germany, and he helped to come up with the idea that plants are composed of cells and put his work together with Theodor Schwann, and that said that all animals are composed of cells, and that's where you get the cell theory, which states what? All living things are made of cells. And that's where we started in our first week on talking about the basic things that compose living things. So the cell theory states that all living things are composed of cells, that all cells come from pre-existing cells, not free cell formation, right? And so with that idea, that essentially they come from another cell that's in your body. And the basic unit, of life is a cell. So that's essentially the cell theory. So what we're going to do when we get back is we're going to talk about the different types of cells, essentially prokaryote and eukaryote, and further subdivide these. If you look in here, you can see some of the basic cells that we are looking at. And on here, you can see atoms and small molecules in those sizes. And then basically, we need anything that's under about here. We need things called electron microscopes to see. Now, electron microscopes, how regular microscopes up here, these are all light microscopes. So electron microscopes, where light microscopes use light to see things, electron microscopes probably use what? You're right, electrons. So essentially they throw electrons at these things, the electrons bounce off, and then they collect them, and due to how they bounce off, you can see them. So these, you're going to notice if you look in your book, these guys are normally black and white. Sometimes they colorize them. And you'll see in the description, they'll be called SEMs. Now, on here, the rest of these can be seen using a light microscope. For instance, if you look at a cell, you'll be able to see the nucleus easily, and then you'll see little dots, and those are mitochondria. So you'll be able to see those at 40x when we get into the lab this week. And then some of the others, you'll be able to see plants and animal cells. And then up here, somewhere around here, you'll be able to actually, anywhere up here, right? You'll be able to see these with your living eye. Can anybody tell me what they think the biggest cell is? And there's actually two here. It essentially depends on kind of putting it all together or lengthwise. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with a bird. So an ostrich egg is actually one of the largest cells. You can see that whole egg. When you look at an egg, that's a single cell there initially. And so an ostrich egg is the biggest cell along with squids. There are some squids that they found in the deep sea that they're the size of boats. And there are nerve cells that start from the beginning of the squid all the way to the end. And though visibly they're really, really thin, they're really long. So depending on how you like to define what the largest cell, those are a couple of them. So when we come back, we're going to get into part 2 of this, and essentially it's going to be talking about cell types. See you soon.